Hello and welcome. This is a public affairs forum sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. These forums are conducted most Sundays here at the church site, 4700 Grover Avenue in North Central Austin. We'd invite you to come and join us. The forums are free and open to the public, and we extend a cordial invitation to you. My name is Luther Elmore. This church has been conducting these forums since the church was first incorporated in 1954, and they're to further the mission of this church to nourish souls, transform lives, and do justice. Today, our speaker will be introduced by one of our long-serving and prominent forum members, Mr. Eric Hartman. Eric.
Thank you, Luther. We're going to be hearing today about the Workers' Defense Project, which has been described by the New York Times as one of the nation's most creative organizations for workers, particularly for immigrant workers. The Workers' Defense Project is truly a bright spot in what many see as a pretty dark time for progressive policy and politics. It has found ways to make progress at the state and local level, even when progressive policies seem to be under constant assault nationally. As an old union guy myself, I am really excited to see new generations of activists being drawn into this work and lighting the way forward. Our speaker today is a great example of that. He's filling in for Worker Defense Project Executive Director Jose Garza, and he is a worthy surrogate. Bo Delp, the director of the Worker Defense Project's core program, the Better Builder program, is spending all of his time fighting to improve working conditions in the construction industry in Texas and achieving a great deal in that regard, which we're about to hear about. He's been with the Workers' Defense Project since 2015. Before that, he helped lead multiple Texas-based political campaigns and worked at the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. He holds a BA from Texas Tech, so his Texas credentials are in good order. But he also has an interesting history, academically otherwise, with a PhD from Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. I'm sure there's a good story about that he can tell. Anyway, I'm eager to hear what he has to say, so I'm going to get out of the way and ask you to join me in welcoming Bo Delp. Thank you.
Can y'all hear me okay? So glad to hear it. Thank you so much, Eric, for that very warm introduction, and thank y'all so much for having me here today. I cannot think of a better way to spend my Sunday afternoon than with y'all, talking about issues that matter. And thank y'all so much for having this public affairs forum. I am truly honored to be here and included in a list of very prestigious speakers across the region. I am substituting for our executive director today, Jose Garza. I will do the best that I can. So try to stick with me if you can. There's a couple of things that I'd like to do today. I'd like to talk a little bit about Workers' Defense Project, who we are. Perhaps you've heard of us, perhaps you have not. Talk about some of the issues that we focus on at Workers' Defense Project. And I'd like to spend, if that's okay, the bulk of our time today talking about a particular campaign that we have been working on for quite some time, which is to require that all employers provide and all employees receive paid sick days in the city of Austin. This is a campaign that has been heating up over the last couple of months, and if there's time perhaps to have some conversation at the end, I think that would be really beneficial, and I'd love to hear from you. So again, my name is Bo Delp. I am the Better Builder Program and Policy Director at Workers' Defense Project. And so let me tell you a little bit about Workers' Defense. We were founded in 2002 at Casa Marianella, and we came to exist because a group of volunteers came together to try to address some challenges that they saw. Immigrant families were coming into Casa Marianella. They were often the victims of wage theft. And those volunteers back in 2002 realized two things. One, that people who were the victims of wage theft were disproportionately immigrant families. And we also discovered back in 2002 that those individuals were disproportionately working in the Texas construction industry. And so we began to provide what limited legal services we could with attorneys on a pro bono basis and paralegals to recover back wages, file mechanics liens, and other tactics to try to create some sense of dignity and respect for the men and women who build our city. And from 2002 until 2009, 2010, that is what we did. We organized construction workers, and we demanded dignity and respect from contractors who were not following the law to get back wages and dignity on the workplace. Starting in 2009, we began to think about ways that we could create more structural changes in the construction industry. As helpful as it was to get back wages for workers, each week would be a new set of workers and crews and a new set of contractors to have to hold accountable. So we began to think about how public policy and how research could begin to create a larger conversation about how construction happens here in the city of Austin. So we got a rest break ordinance passed that requires 10 minutes of rest for every 4 hours of work for construction workers in the hot Texas sun during the summer. We later got one passed in Dallas, and so now over 345,000 construction workers in the state of Texas have access to rest breaks where they did not previously. We also have put out several research studies, and some of them you'll hear about in my remarks today. And so instead of going too much into that, I'll just kind of let those come about when we talk about the construction industry. I talked a little bit about some of the wage theft issues that we saw for all those years in the Texas construction industry. And it is absolutely true to say that we focus on construction because of the dire challenges men and women working in construction face. First, you probably don't need me to tell you that the real estate, development, and construction industries are powerful industries in the state of Texas. Between 1997 and 2010, the population of Texas continued to grow. Many of you who have been in Austin for a long time have watched this city truly transform into something very different than what it was, and there has been corresponding construction along the way. So the population has continued to increase in Texas, and the demand for infrastructure and housing has continued to grow with it, thus construction. Now, construction in Texas accounts for about 1 out of every $20 generated by the Texas economy, and over 10% of all construction output in the United States. So there are 50 states, but Texas being so big and growing so fast, needing so many houses and infrastructure, accounts for about 10% of total construction output in the United States. In 2011, the Texas single-handedly accounted for 16% of all housing construction permits in the United States, more than Florida and California combined. Going back to, I think, the powerful construction industry that we are up against at Workers' Defense Project, a recent Texas Tribune article that was published before the second legislative session this year, the special session, the 30-day session, highlighted what we at Workers' Defense Project have known for years, that the real estate and construction lobby have profound roles in how local and state regulations are written and written for their benefit. I'll just read briefly from that article. According to a study from Texans for Public Justice, Governor Abbott received $10.7 million from groups that could benefit or be impacted by regulatory rollbacks expected to be included in this legislation. The report says Abbott has received $6.4 million from construction interests and $4.2 million from real estate interests since he launched his gubernatorial campaign in 2013. All told, the TPJ reports that 15% of Abbott's funds in the past 2 years come from real estate and construction interests. So this is a powerful industry that construction workers are up against. We know in the state of Texas that about 50% of construction workers are undocumented. And when you have that huge power imbalance, construction industry lobbyists bankrolling campaigns and elections across the state to shape the rules and regulations to their benefit, compare that to immigrant families who are coming to Texas to take jobs that often don't do a whole lot. In fact, what we know is that to be a construction worker in the state of Texas is pretty tough. Despite soaring profits, construction workers faced often very deadly working conditions, low pay, no benefits, and a total lack of dignity and respect in the work site. In fact, according to OSHA, statistics from 2015 tell us that a construction worker dies on the site in Texas once every 3 days. 1 in 5 seriously injured due to unsafe and often deadly working conditions. And keep in mind, Texas is the only state in the country that does not require any form of workers' compensation insurance coverage. According to a study done in collaboration with the Ray Marshall Center here at the University of Texas in Austin, 50% of Texas construction workers report receiving poverty-level wages and being denied overtime pay despite working more than 40 hours a week. Now, we know that we cannot depend on the state legislature to address these issues. As we have seen, when they aren't taking money from developers or the construction industry, they are just as likely to pass hateful legislation like SB 4 or to call ICE on immigrant families when they speak up. By ICE, I mean Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And we can't depend on the federal government either, whose leader calls immigrant families rapists and criminals and is insistent on building a wall on our border. So in response to many of these challenges that we see in the Texas construction industry, Workers Defense Project does a couple of different things to try to address them. First, we have an adult and education training division that provides OSHA classes, English classes, computer classes, other training opportunities for construction workers and their families who come in through our doors. We also have an employment and legal services division who provides legal services to victims of wage theft. And since 2002, they have recovered over $1.6 million in back wages for construction workers and their families in the state of Texas through legal and direct action. I talked a little bit about our policy program. We also have the Better Builder program, which partners directly with developers and public institutions to create a higher set of uniform conditions for construction workers and their families, including things like living wages, safety training, workers' comp, access to apprenticeship and other training, and more robust enforcement. Since 2012, Better Builder standards have been on over $1 billion worth of construction here in Central Texas and have positively impacted over 14,000 construction workers. It is also worth noting that Workers Defense has become increasingly involved in the fight around Senate Bill 4, the Show Me Your Papers anti-immigrant racist legislation that was passed by the Texas legislature earlier this year. This turns our police force into immigration officials that can demand proof of documentation at any step where previously it did not exist. It's worth mentioning that we are currently in litigation with the state of Texas. We've sued the state around SB 4 in coordination with the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, and we've been mobilizing around the increase in deportations that we've seen under this current administration. So there's just a few things that Workers Defense has been up to and works on, the values that we hold to create dignity and respect for immigrant families working in the construction industry, but also some of the solutions that we see to transform the industry to one that provides good, safe, middle-class jobs for families who want to get into the construction industry and gain access to training. But what I'd like to talk about most today is a campaign that we've been working on since earlier this year around Paid Sick Days campaign, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I alluded to it earlier. Earlier, I did mention some of the challenges faced by the men and women who build this fine city. There is one statistic, however, that I did not mention. Half of Latinos living in Austin do not have access to paid sick days, 1 in 2. In the Texas construction industry, specifically in the city of Austin, 70% of individuals do not have access to paid sick days. So many individuals that we meet who come in through our doors because they've been the victims of wage theft have story after story of having to make difficult decisions. They've been injured on the job, and they are the primary earner in their family and have to make a very difficult choice between going back to work, having been injured and trying to work through it, or staying at home to rest and recover and taking a pay cut. We hear it all the time. I will briefly mention one story I heard about an individual in that exact circumstance who fell 15 feet from a ladder. He had to continue to keep working because he was the only one earning money in his family at the time. And he did this until his neck hurt so bad he went to a doctor, and the doctor told him, "You can never work in construction again," and they put a metal plate into his neck, and he can't do the one thing that he's been able to do to earn money for his family. These are the decisions that people had to make. Now, what the doctor told him is if he had rested and sought medical care and attention at that time, things could have been different, but he had no choice. Now, more broadly, outside of the Texas construction industry, and specifically the Austin construction industry, a lack of access to paid sick days is a very serious issue. I'd like to walk you through what we know about the Austin workforce and those who do not have access to paid sick days. What we know is that 223,000 individuals living in this city do not have access to paid sick days. That's about 36% of the total workforce. There's a couple of breakdowns that I do think are particularly compelling, and I know I'm throwing a lot of facts at y'all, but I feel like this is good information to keep in mind as this conversation continues to heat up here in the city of Austin. So we know that roughly a third of individuals who identify as white do not have paid sick days. 41% of those who identify as African American do not have paid sick days. I said 1 in 2 of Latinos living here in Austin do not have paid sick days. And we know by industry that people who are in healthcare, 22% do not have access to paid sick days. 36% of those working in sales and in general office conditions do not have paid sick days. And 65% of Austin workers working in the service industry, whether they work in a hotel or a restaurant, do not have access to paid sick days. This also disproportionately impacts people who are in low-income jobs. 46%, 1 in 2 Austin workers who earn between $15,000 and $35,000 do not have access to paid sick days. So, it was this observed reality that led us to become a founding member of the Work Strong Austin Coalition. That includes the Fight for 15, the Center for Public Policy Priorities, Unite Here, which represents hotel workers, and the Young Active Labor Leaders, to ask that City Council pass an ordinance requiring a minimum number of paid sick days for all employees in the city of Austin. So what I'd like to do is briefly walk y'all through a couple of issues that have come up along the way around paid sick days so that we can talk about them. More specifically, there have been questions around what are paid sick days? What can they be used for? How many days should individuals get? How should that be enforced? And in addition, who should have access to them? Is it just some workers or perhaps all workers? First, let me just briefly go over what we believe paid sick days are. Paid sick days are days that an employee earns or accrues or gains access to through employment that allows individuals to take compensated time to take care of themselves or a loved one. Paid sick days have been passed in 40 jurisdictions across the country, cities, counties, and states, including Arizona, Seattle, Boston, Washington State, New York City, and others. So another question that has come up is, what can paid sick days be used for? Paid sick days laws change from place to place. Every city, every state, depending on the regulatory environment in which they're living, try to come up with what they think is the best approximation and best possible policy, depending on the local politics. At its core, it enables employees to stay home if they are sick. However, we believe that a strong paid sick days policy here in the city of Austin should also require employees to be able to take paid sick days if they need to take care of a loved one, whether it be a child or a parent or a sibling, or whether they need to take care of ongoing medical conditions like asthma, seek preventative care, or provide safe time to deal with domestic violence or sexual assault. Now, there's been a lot of conversation around who should have access to paid sick days. And I'll get a little more into the controversy here in a little while. But one of the questions that has come up is who should get access to paid sick days? Is it just full-time employees? Is it just part-time employees? Is it some combination of the two? Should we exempt certain industries? Should we allow some industries to decide how many days they're going to provide to opt in or to opt out? These are the questions that have been coming up in this campaign. We believe that all workers should receive paid sick days. Just like all workers are entitled to a minimum wage, we know that all workers get sick, but not everyone has time to get better. All employees, full-time and part-time, should be able to receive, and employers should provide, paid sick days for Austin families. Now, there are a couple of reasons that we believe that paid sick days are really important to the city of Austin, and I'd like to go over a few of those right now. I'd like to talk about how paid sick days are good for Austin families. I'd like to talk about how paid sick days are good for the Austin economy. I'd like to talk about how they're good for business. And I'd like to talk about how they are very important for public health. But I'd like to start by reading you a quote. This is a quote, and I'll tell you who it's from and when it's from after. The quote is this, quote, "This bill would create chaos in business never yet known to us. It sets an all-time high in crackpot legislation. Let me make it very clear that I am not opposed to the social theory. No decent American citizen can take exception to this attitude. What I do take exception to is any approach to a solution of this problem which is utterly impractical and in operation would be much more destructive than constructive to the very purposes which it is designed to serve." The author of that statement is United States Representative Arthur Philip Lamnick from Ohio. He argued, as many did, including businesses nearly 80 years ago, that proposed laws that would abolish child labor and set minimum wages would be detrimental to the American economy. Those minimum standards did not destroy the American economy. We know that with hindsight. Neither did FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, neither will paid sick days here in Austin. Many years ago, we as a society decided it was both moral and economically more efficient to ensure that children are in the classroom rather than a coal mine. I would like to meet the person who says we are not a better nation because of that law. Yet at the time, it was very controversial. The reality is, when low-wage workers are forced to move from job to job because they are getting sick and then let go because they cannot fulfill their responsibilities, then we have an economically inefficient system. People are prevented from fulfilling their full potential and capacity as humans and as workers. When more families are self-sufficient, we all benefit. For many Texas households currently struggling to cover basic expenses, days of lost pay lead to financial turmoil. In fact, for the average American worker without earned sick days, 3 days of lost pay is equivalent to an entire monthly grocery budget. Now I want y'all to think about that for a second. If you get sick and you're sick for 3 days and you have to make a choice to stay home because you are so sick you are unable to work, if you do not have a paid sick day policy, you take a pay cut. What that statistic tells us is that if you are sick for 3 days and have to take that pay cut, that is, for the average American worker, the equivalent of what it takes to put food on the table for your family for an entire month. Definitely something to think about. What's more is, as I think all proud that most of us are with a minimum wage, as low as it currently is, and we will get to that later, of $7.25, we know that for individuals who are earning the minimum wage and are also suffering because of these decisions that they have to make, it is very clear that they are a sub-minimum wage earner. I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of city or state or country that I want to live in. Because the reality is, earned sick days are also really good for the economy. We know that earned sick days improve productivity and reduce worker turnover, which is a significant expense to employers to bring somebody on and to have to train them on how to do their job in the organization. It takes time and it takes money. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, workers are 25% likely to leave their job over a 5-month period if they have access to earned sick days, which intuitively makes sense. You have a basic safety net to not have to make the choice and perhaps leave or be fired because you can't fulfill your responsibilities because you're sick. The cost to employers nationwide of people working while sick is $160 billion a year from decreased productivity and unnecessarily extended illnesses. Now, I don't know about y'all, I'm one of those people that when I get sick, it's really hard for me to roll out of bed or do anything, much less go to work. I cannot imagine doing a job in the construction industry or the service industry where I'm interacting with people, pulling heavy equipment, operating heavy machinery with the flu. I can't imagine. I truly cannot. And that's the decision that people have to make. And if they do make it to work, this particular study said that their productivity, surprise, is reduced and the economy suffers. There's another reason why paid sick days in Austin, Texas makes sense. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but for now, let me say that requiring paid sick days for the city of Austin is a common sense investment for our public health that has both a moral and economic impact. Earned sick days make communities healthier and reduce healthcare expenditures. For example, according to a study done by the National Bureau for Economic Research, flu infection rates decrease by approximately 6 to 7% in cities with an earned sick days policy. Parents without earned sick days are 2 times more likely to send their children to school sick. I have personally heard several stories in this campaign of teachers that talk about the impact that sick children who come to work have on the classroom. What they have said is this: a parent who does not have paid sick days cannot stay home with their child when they get sick. They have to make a decision to take a pay cut or to treat the classroom like a daycare and send them because that's the only place that they can go. The parent can't stay at home. The sick child goes to school. There's a good chance they get the kids sick. Those kids then get their family sick, or they get the teacher sick, and there has to be a substitute teacher. So it has a profound impact on education and how we educate our children in this community. But what we do know is that when people are given the basic right to stay home and recover from things like the flu infection rates go down. And I think that's a very important point this flu season. So what we know is that paid sick days are good for our economy, they're good for businesses, they're good for families, and they're good for public health. Now, finally, I'd like to take a moment and really go through the current state of the campaign. It has not been without controversy. Businesses have come out very strongly in support of paid sick days and in opposition. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that at this time. For the last few legislative cycles at this state legislature, a statewide paid sick days policy has been discussed. Unfortunately, for all the reasons that I outlined earlier, Greg Abbott and his corporate donors have shown nothing but contempt for working families in that building, not too terribly far from where we are now. Locally, we launched this campaign on Labor Day, September 4th, 2017. In late September, Austin City Council voted unanimously to pass a resolution to initiate a stakeholder process that would seek input from businesses, employees, advocates, and other impacted organizations about what a paid sick days policy in Austin could and should look like. The last stakeholder session was held on November 30th, and the stakeholder leaders will be submitting a report back to the Austin City Council on December 5th. So I think it's about 2 days from now. Earlier, I outlined why paid sick days are good for families, businesses, our economy, and for public health. But I would also like to briefly address some of the feedback I heard during these stakeholder sessions from the business community. I should note, before breaking down some of their individual arguments, it is very important for me to stress that many small businesses have come out in support of paid sick days. Last month, nearly 24 small businesses here in Austin wrote a letter and submitted it to Austin City Council. I'd like to read you just a brief excerpt from that letter. No one should have to choose between paying the bills or taking care of themselves or a loved one when they're sick. The City of Austin can prevent the escalation of illness and transmission to others through a citywide paid sick days policy. A citywide paid sick days policy will also help the playing field so that employers who do the right thing by their employees won't be at a competitive disadvantage. Giving working people the time to take care of themselves and their loved ones when they're sick is good for Austin families and our community as a whole. Now, despite the support of so many businesses that have come out in support of paid sick days, we have heard from some very dark corners of the business community about perceived challenges for industry around paid sick days, and I'd like to take a moment just to address them. The first thing that we've heard from a handful of businesses and primarily industry associations nationally and at the state level have said that this ordinance will cost businesses money and could force businesses to even shut down. Sounds pretty scary. But the hard truth is that illnesses already have an impact on our economy. Without paid sick days, the reality is that the cost is being shouldered by the worker. I once heard an analogy made between a corporation and a shark. The latter was described as a killing machine, had one thing on its mind always. The former was described as what they called an externalizing machine. The corporation has a single purpose: to externalize. This is achieved by minimizing costs, maximizing the revenue. A way to do that is to privatize their gains and socialize their losses. Let me give you two examples to tell you what I'm talking about. Because the Texas construction industry, the industry that we focus on, does not provide either workers' compensation or health insurance to most individuals working in that industry. When an individual is injured, they usually first go through any meager savings they have to seek medical attention. Sometimes they go into debt. Sometimes they turn to payday lenders. And then they go to the county hospital to seek basic treatment. This cost is pushed from the company that refuses to provide health care or workers' comp onto the taxpayer. So when we get our tax bill every year, we know there's a portion of that that is being paid because somewhere a construction contractor has made a decision not to provide workers' compensation insurance to the people working on that site. What we know is that in the Texas construction industry, according to a study that we did with Public Citizen, we estimated that the Texas construction industry shifts an estimated $895 million per year onto Texas construction workers, their families, and taxpayers, and costs associated with illnesses and injuries. We've heard stories of subcontractors that have driven workers who have been seriously injured on the job to the county hospital, drop them off, and then go back to work. This is the reality for many people living in Austin, Texas. Let me give you another example. When a restaurant does not provide paid sick days to their servers or to their cooks, and a worker is forced to come to work sick because they have to put food on the table for their family or pay rent, there is a chance that they will spread that disease. When that happens, there is a chance that you and me as consumers, as patrons of that restaurant, will also get sick. Then we go to the doctor to get medical attention. We go to Walgreens or a drugstore to get what we need to feel better. That costs us money. And when that happens, the restaurant has essentially pushed that cost onto you and me as consumers. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's right. all companies, whether they are restaurants or hotels or construction subcontractors, should have an equal need to ensure that all workers in this city have the ability to stay home and get better before they spread disease or before they have to send their kids to school or other consequences that we've talked about today. But the bottom line is that these costs already exist. Companies are just making sure through not providing a paid sick days policy that the worker or the patron or the consumer shoulders that cost instead of them. Now, I'd like to take this argument just one step further. Earlier this year, the Austin Chamber of Commerce sent an alert to their members with concerns they had regarding an Austin paid sick days ordinance. After outlining their concerns, they cited a 2014 implementation study from the University of Washington, which looked at the implementation of Seattle's paid sick days ordinance. It was an interesting choice and a telling study to cite. They surveyed 1,460 Seattle businesses and went further and interviewed 24 employers in Seattle. I'd like to read just a brief major finding from the report. Quote, cost to employers and impact on businesses have been modest and smaller than anticipated. Anecdotal cost information puts the cost of providing leave at about 0.4% of total revenue. There is no evidence that the ordinance caused employers to go out of business or leave Seattle. One last point is worth digging deeper into this study. The study looked at different metrics of economic growth as this began to be implemented. All three measures of employment, the study says, number of Seattle firms with more than 4 employees, total numbers of Seattle employees, and total Seattle wages grew in absolute terms over the first year of the ordinance. In other words, using the same study cited by the Austin Chamber of Commerce, we can see that far from being a drag on the Seattle economy, benefits to workers were great, costs to businesses were negligible, and businesses not only stayed in Seattle after the ordinance, but grew, hired more workers, and raised wages. One last note I'd like to say on cost. We should not forget that just 2 days ago, the United States Senate took the federal government one step closer to administering a substantial transfer of wealth from working families to corporations. As a New York Times article recently lamented, I think it was yesterday, quote, corporate taxes, along with those on wealthy Americans, could be slashed on the presumption that when people in penthouses get relief, the benefits flow down to the basement tenants. The Times continued. Republicans have pitched the bill as a middle-class tax cut, and the overhaul is intended to immediately cut taxes for about 70% of middle-class families. But it would raise them on millions of others. Since the Senate plan eliminates some tax breaks like the deduction for state and local income taxes and phases out the individual tax cuts at the end of 2025. Businesses fare far better, with the corporate tax cut to 20% from 35% and made permanent. It also offers a large tax break for the owners of small businesses and other companies that are not organized as traditional corporations, a provision that was sweetened in a last-minute deal to bring 2 wavering senators on board. In sum, as businesses large and small reap huge rewards from tax cuts for the wealthy and tax increases on middle-class earners, we should take any alarms they raise about the impact on businesses with a big grain of salt. Not only were they doing fine where paid sick days are mandatory, they're doing even better under the current administration. Now, another criticism we've heard from some corners of the business community is that this is a regulation rather than a voluntary program. And the argument goes something like this. Don't make us do this, they say. If we decide to provide paid sick days, then reward us. Give us a tax cut. Give us an incentive. That's how to do it. First, you should know this is lobbying 101 from corporate America. They turn a requirement into a goal in exchange for some kind of incentive. Second, there is a reason we don't make rules for Wall Street optional or aspirational. We run the serious risk of bad actors continuing to refuse to offer paid sick days and participating in an even greater transfer of wealth from taxpayers to corporations. Third, taking their logic at face value, why stop at paid sick days? Why don't we reward a business for providing minimum wage? Why don't we provide incentives to a business because they do not employ children in their place of business? Sometimes, as is with the case of paid sick days, it is just the right thing to do, and their reward is getting to continue to stay in business. Now, some businesses have taken an even stronger stance and asked that small businesses be exempt completely from the ordinance. Many families work for small businesses and work just as hard as people who work for large companies. Working for a small business doesn't lessen the likelihood of getting sick, and employees for small businesses shouldn't have to choose between taking care of themselves or a loved one. All workers in Austin should get mandatory paid sick days. Now, Austin is poised to become the first city in Texas and the first city in the U.S. South to require paid sick days, which is incredibly exciting for all of us in this room. We have a unique opportunity to do something very different in this region. There are two ways you can get involved. First, if you have Facebook, I would recommend you start following the coalition, Work Strong Austin. There you'll be able to receive updates about what we're doing, the actions and events that are going on, and it's the best way to begin to understand how we're going to get this done, because it will take all of us. The second thing that you can do to get involved is to reach out to your council member. Perhaps you have a compelling story of when you were sick and you had to make that choice. Perhaps you're a business owner who already provides paid sick days or supports it, wants to do it, but doesn't want to be put at a competitive disadvantage against another business. Whatever it is, City Council needs to hear from you. The reality is it is often very difficult to connect local government issues to larger state and national trends. Here in Texas, we have more minimum wage jobs than any other state. Now, I saw a recent study that told me that if the minimum wage had kept pace with historical trends since it was implemented back in the 30s, it would today be about $21 an hour had it kept pace with inflation. Despite soaring corporate profits, today in Texas it is still $7.25. Nationally, as I said, we are witnessing a massive transfer of wealth to businesses, and I suspect that these tax cuts will be applauded by many of the same industry associations as a victory, who will also try to convince Austin City Council that somehow the paid sick days ordinance will cause their businesses to shutter. Both in Texas and nationally, it is a simple formula for many lawmakers who are in power today. The lower the pay for working families, the higher the profits for their corporate donors. And the fact is that lobbyists and lawmakers alike have tried to convince us that by cutting the corporate tax rate, wages and benefits will trickle down to workers. But instead of leaving that to chance, we have an opportunity to guarantee that happens by passing paid sick days. If they want to shop around trickle-down economics to say that these tax cuts result in higher wages and benefits, let's not leave it up to them. Let's guarantee it by getting a paid sick days ordinance passed. Because just like the minimum wage, overtime, and child labor laws, paid sick days are the unfinished business of the New Deal. Hundreds of employees, activists, and business owners have come out to support this campaign in Austin. And we will need you. We will need everyone to overcome some of the nation's most powerful interests to show that we can be the kind of city that ensures that no one has to choose between getting sick and taking a pay cut. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bo. We only have about 15 minutes left, so we'll have a period of question and answer. So please keep your questions very short so that he can answer as many questions as possible.
I wanted to ask you about the issue of business allies. I think part of what makes the case compelling is your ability to cite business support. and the argument in particular about the competitive disadvantage that the good guys would suffer if others were allowed to ignore this sort of mandate. So I wonder if you could elaborate on the business allies that are involved, for instance, in the stakeholder meetings, and tell us a little more about that angle.
Sure. You may have seen on KView not too terribly long ago, there was a story, television story about a press conference of small business allies who came together to outline their support for a paid sick days ordinance on the Work Strong Austin. So we have workstrongaustin.org as well as the Facebook page. The letter and the businesses are online and we can see them. Wheatsville is one of them. The Purple Fig Cleaning Company is another. Botticelli's on South Congress is another. Several tech companies, Beatnik Foods have come together from really across sectors in Austin to talk about why it is incredibly important to get this done, why they do it for their employees. Some of them, there is a compelling business reason. They say that it helps retain people who they want to keep. They also just think it's the right thing to do. It increases worker productivity. We've heard all kinds of reasons that these businesses have decided to provide paid sick days or would like to, but need their competition to do it as well.
Does the Workers' Defense Project keep a list of all the businesses in Austin currently that do have paid sick leave that support this campaign?
Well, it's interesting you say that. We don't have a list, but what is important, when I said at the beginning that 37% of Austin workers do not have paid sick days, the converse to that statistic is that 63% already have it. And so what we know is that there are businesses everywhere. I was at a stakeholder meeting where a worker at a major grocery store here in town provides paid sick days, no questions asked. And so while we don't have a list, what the vast majority of businesses, workers do have it, and the Austin economy is doing great. What we're saying is there are a lot of workers who do not have access to paid sick days, and our economy for those families could be even better.
You mentioned something earlier at the end of your talk that about the economics of insurance. And why is it when I hear employers talk, they mention the exorbitant cost of workman's compensation insurance? Why can that be spread out to where it would be a fair price for workers to pay for their employees?
Well, you'll hear no argument from me. I mean, we absolutely believe that one, more workers need to have workers' compensation insurance coverage, and so we think everybody should. And remember, it's important to remember why we even have workers' comp. At the turn of the century, the 20th century, companies were running into this problem where workers were suing them in the courts because they were being injured, and the settlements were huge. And so workers' comp, the system, was this grand bargain between workers and employers to say, we're going to systematize this a little bit and give you these payouts that are more structured, but you can't come and sue us. That system has broken down, especially in Texas where workers' comp is not a requirement. But whatever the cost of providing workers' comp to a worker, I can tell you this, it is far smaller than what it costs for an immigrant family to have to cover the cost of being injured on the job alone.
Earlier in your presentation, I think you mentioned that Arizona was the only state that had is a state that has a statewide law.
No, not the only state, but it is a state. Arizona, Washington State, California, New York City, Massachusetts. So there are other states that have passed.
How long have those been in effect, and what does the data show about that?
What I can tell you is a couple of things. Paid sick days have been a minimum standard that workers have been asking for a long time. We've started to see some traction across the country since I think 2008. I believe San Francisco was the first city to pass this. But really since 2008, you begin to see cities and counties and states pass paid sick day ordinances and laws. I've mentioned some of them. I think from an economic and business perspective, what I think is very clear for me is that some of these places have far more robust economies than Austin and in the state of Texas, even if you take California. So the reality is that the businesses, the local businesses, the small businesses, the large businesses in these cities and states where paid sick days are implemented are doing just fine.
Tomas Rodriguez, and I'm curious, there are so many large Christian organizations in town. Are any of them allies of your program?
So we are, that's a great question. We are a member at Workers' Defense Project of Austin Interfaith, and they have been coming to the stakeholder meetings. We have a labor caucus inside of Austin Interfaith, and so yes, we do participate with faith institutions who have spoken strongly on this issue.
You talked about your prior work in your earlier remarks. You talked about your work in regards to construction workers, and you trying to reclaim the wage theft from the employers. In those situations in which you've been involved, were the employers and the companies themselves fined, or are you just able to recover the wages?
Well, I will tell you that in the state of Texas, and this was a point that I alluded to at the beginning of our conversation together, construction and developer lobbyists and interests have been very successful in writing the rules as they relate to their respective industries. And so it is very difficult for an individual construction worker to navigate the state of Texas, the Texas Workforce Commission, process of getting back wages. It can be lengthy. It definitely favors businesses from multiple perspectives. And so it is just very difficult for an individual construction worker to navigate that process and successfully get their back wages. We were successful in 2013 in the legislature to actually make wage theft a criminal act. It used to be civil. But that was a really big cross-coalition achievement that we at Workers' Defense Project were able to help shepherd with other organizations to make it a criminal act. It's hard. Again, the system is really designed to benefit the industry rather than the worker, and I think that's one of the reasons why we came to exist, is because there was this need that we've tried to fill. So I am sure that some of the contractors have been fined somewhere along the way, but by and large, getting the back wages is a victory.
About 15 years ago, the Texas Commission on Human Rights dissolved, and the Austin City Human Rights Commission dissolved. And as far as I can tell, EEOC is not lifting its head out of the water very often these days. However, the law is still there. And if a person wants to file a lawsuit, there's a way to do that through local lawyers. Is that something that you're interested in, and let us know how that works?
Absolutely. So when there's a compelling case, I should say that our Employment Legal Services Division not only has in-house attorneys, but also routinely works with attorneys outside of Workers' Defense Project. We have a very good relationship with an organization in town called the Equal Justice Center that also does some construction work. Yes, but to answer your question, if there is a case, we want to hold contractors to the fullest extent of the law, so we do what we can.
And again, I'm very interested in hearing more about the immigration work that you've done, and in particular, I'm still focused on this question about business allies and your experience with businesses that are interested in securing an immigrant workforce.
Sure, and it has been a very interesting experience in that way. Now, I will tell you that I have colleagues at Workers' Defense who have been far more involved in the fight against SB4 than I have, and I wish they were here today and they could tell you all about it. But we saw this as a critical moment for our members and our organization. Workers' Defense Project, 50% of our board is comprised of construction workers and their families. And there was a moment not too long ago where, with DAPA and DACA, we began to see perhaps there could be a path forward on comprehensive immigration reform. That moment passed. Things have obviously deteriorated quite a bit. with discussion of building a wall and with SB4. And so we have tried to the best of our ability, working with our allies, to organize around this issue, to ensure that immigrant families, regardless of their immigration status, feel protected and safe and know that there are legal remedies and limits to what local law enforcement can do. And what was particularly interesting about that fight from my perspective was two things. One, there were strong and very powerful business voices at the legislature that did not support SB4. They felt that it would cause long-term damage to the Texas economy for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning of our talk together. You create forget the human rights morality, which I think is very important and critical to why I do the work that I do, but just getting down to the economics of it, it's a very economically inefficient system that is not good for business, they said, to have so many people living in one place in Texas, living in the shadows and in fear day to day, fearing that they would go to work someday and on their way get pulled over and deported and they wouldn't see their family again. There's a lot of stress and a lot of implications for that. And so a lot of businesses did not support SB4. A lot of associations did not support SB4. But you have to have the conversation in tandem with another one, which is to say that while there were some construction associations that did not support SB4, make no mistake that while they understand that their industry is dependent on immigrant families coming to Texas to build infrastructure, roads, highways, office buildings, that participation is conditional on bare bones regulations and poverty level wages. So sure, you can stay, but it's going to be on our terms. And that is, I think, the perspective that many industry associations had at the legislature. We want you here, we need you here, and if you're working in the service industry, we want to make sure you keep getting paid $2 an hour. And if you work in construction, we want to make sure that you're not getting workers' comp. That's the mentality of many associations, in my experience, that we had to deal with. And my hope is that those associations will begin to see the long-term damage that SB4 has and will continue to cause, and we can begin to talk about mitigation in the next legislative cycle.
Bo Delp, thank you for your time and your presentation, and thank you and the Workers' Defense Project for the great work you're doing. Thank you once again.
Thank you.